Hello, lovely souls, and welcome to Emily Whispers. I'm Emily, and I'm so happy you decided to join me tonight. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and say hello. I love connecting with each of you. If these little moments bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can share more of them together. Now find your cozy spot. Wrap yourself in a blanket if you like. Take a slow, gentle breath, and let's drift into tonight's story. I was a real fool when I was young. I fell into stealing cars, ran afoul of the law, and ended up with two choices: go to juvenile hall or take part in a court-ordered program called Camp Ridgeview. Camp Ridgeview was, unsurprisingly, an outdoor rehabilitation camp. The owner must have had connections, because he managed to get a steady supply of cheap labor so long as the kids signed up to avoid prison. That sounds exploitative, I guess, but looking back, I am not sure who benefited most. I cannot speak for the others, but the place straightened me out. Learning to start a fire and find drinkable water was useful. But what saved me was learning how to care for something and see it grow. It fixed a part of my head I did not know was broken. I made friends I still check in with on social media because we live far apart now. Camp Ridgeview gave me discipline and some belief in myself, which was remarkable considering I signed up thinking it would be a youth prison. Funny thing is that after all the stupid, dangerous stuff I did on the streets, the worst thing I ever went through happened at Camp Ridgeview. When you arrived at Ridgeview, you were assigned a job and a bunkmate. Jobs ranged from plant identification and shelter building to route finding and basic medical tasks. Your bunkmate was there to break you into the routine and keep you honest. Those bunkmates were usually people who had moved up through the program and could speak from the heart about how it worked. That is how it worked with my own mentor. And a few seasons later, I was glad when I was handed the same role. Earning the right to mentor was not automatic. I treated it as an honor. For the first time, I felt useful, and I wanted to give that back. Around 9 months into the program, I had become the lead route finder and had been given my own 2-person tent in preparation for a new mentee. The tents were strictly divided by gender, so I knew my mentee would be a girl. What I could not tell until I met her was how willing she would be to learn. If she was calm and open, the month would glide by. If she was stubborn, it could be brutal. I had heard horror stories about uncooperative mentees, how arguments sometimes turned violent. I did not want that. My plan was simple. I would calm her, earn her trust, and build a bond. It was the exact tactic that had worked on me. The day my mentee arrived, I felt a real buzz of nerves. She was sullen at first, but most were. She went through the induction with the rest of the group, and then spent a few days with me on map practice. She resisted at the start, but she warmed up and learned fast. She was supposed to be with me for a month, and by the middle of that month, she was shaping up. Her name was Maya. She had mood, swings, and edge to her, but we were making progress. By the second week, it seemed like we might have an easy time together. Then the state troopers turned up. 2 of them pulled into camp and started talking with our lead instructor. I walked over under the pretense of curiosity, listening in. The instructor saw me and waved me over. The troopers had come from the city looking for someone. That someone was my mentee Maya. She had a warrant in another state, and they were there to arrest her. That left us in a tight spot. We did not know how Maya would react. She could run, or she could panic. She had been volatile when she first arrived, and no one could be sure what she would do. I had an idea. Maybe if I went to her first and told her, she would take the news better from me than from the police. I remembered how, when I was on the streets, even the sight of a patrol car made me want to bolt. I did not want our months of work and the progress she had made to vanish. The plan was agreed, and I walked off toward the tents, thinking that breaking the news gently might keep things calm. She was where I expected, lying in her sleeping bag, pretending not to notice the world. I sat opposite and told her we needed to talk. It was clear she did not know about the warrant. When I told her, she crumpled. Her reaction was raw. She even suggested running before the troopers could see her. But somehow I talked her through it. I reminded her that if she truly had no memory of the thing that got her this warrant, it was probably not a violent crime. I asked if she was sure she did not remember doing anything like a robbery or hurting someone. She said no. I said then it could be a missed court date or a probation issue, and that the leaders would vouch for her so she might come back. That calmed her down, and she agreed to walk with me to speak to the troopers. We left the tents side by side. As we turned the corner toward the lodge, Maya stepped back a little. It was a small hesitation, and I chalked it up to nerves. We kept moving. When I glanced back, I did not see her reach for anything. In the next instant, she had a knife pressed to my throat. Time hollowed out for a second. The cold of the blade was one thing. The shock that it was Maya with it was entirely another. Her free hand held my head steady, while the troopers drew their weapons and approached. Maya ordered me to walk backward. I did. Something in the motion snapped my brain back, and words tumbled out of me. I said her name and begged her to think about what she was doing. She answered that she knew exactly what she was doing. She was not going to jail. She was getting out of there. The troopers were shouting to put the knife down, but she kept walking backward, careful not to cut me. Kids from the bunks had gathered and watched from a distance because of the shouting. We moved toward the tree line near the woods, and the scene turned chaotic. I never once believed she intended to kill me. It felt like panic. She planned to make a run for it once we reached the trees. For a moment, I thought she might stop and listen. She told me to be quiet and kept trying to keep the troopers at bay. I tried to pin down the logic. If she ran on the trails, she would be caught in hours. If she ran into the deep woods, she would face wild animals and rough terrain. I kept saying this would not work. Maya snapped back that it would because they would be too busy saving me to chase her. Those words made my blood run cold. I was convinced she meant me no true harm, that she panicked. Maybe she remembered whatever the warrant was for and realized it was worse than she thought. I do not know. I will never be able to ask her. Then she shouted an apology at the top of her lungs, and I felt wet on my face, but it was not my blood. One of the troopers fired. The bullet struck Maya, and she crumpled to the ground. The knife cut me slightly as she fell, but nothing deep. I dropped to my knees and shook her, trying to wake her. I thought maybe she would live. Miracles happen, but the look in her eyes told me it was over. The officers later said the shot had hit her in a place that ended it instantly. That day was the worst I have ever lived through. I have learned to carry it with me. I tell myself that she might have been about to kill me and that the trooper had to act. I choose to believe that to survive. Still, every day I think of Maya and wish she had made a different choice. I know she might have thought she had no other way. That does not make the image any easier to bear. I've been driving rigs for nearly 40 years, hauling freight in 18-wheelers from Charleston to Sacramento. The road has always been my life, but my real interest is people. Part of the joy of the long haul is meeting the folks at diners and truck stops along the way. Their stories keep the long nights from getting too lonely, and their company over a cup of coffee is worth more than gold. Every so often, you meet a real salt of the earth character, someone you'll remember for the rest of your days. But then sometimes you meet a person who makes you glad you're just passing through. I was at a small roadside diner somewhere in the hills of West Virginia. It was a nice enough place, and for the most part, the people were decent too. I'd been on the road for 10 hours straight, and the place was a welcome sight. It was a warm autumn evening, around 10 o'clock at night. After finishing my meal, I sat at the counter, nursing a black coffee and listening to the local chatter. Most of the patrons were slowly heading out, and even the cook was starting to clean the grill for the night. In the end, it was just me on a stool and the young waitress refilling my cup. I was getting ready to head out myself when an old fella eased onto the stool next to me and started telling me what a fine-looking rig I had parked outside. I told him I appreciated it. We got to talking about trucks and what it's like living a life on the road. I remember after he ordered a coffee for himself, the stranger asked me if I ever had trouble, like breaking down in the middle of nowhere. I told him sure, once or twice, but that sleeping at a busy truck stop could sometimes be way scarier than being stranded on some dark road in the middle of America. He then asked if I carried any protection in the cab with me. I told him most drivers I knew kept a tire iron handy, and that sure, depending on the route, some guys kept something more serious. I made a joke about how I hoped he wasn't a state trooper, and the man chuckled before swearing on his mother's grave that he was no lawman. He then asked if any driver I knew had ever had to use a weapon. I told him I'd heard stories and knew guys who had close calls, but that, by the grace of God, I'd never seen anyone get seriously hurt. He then began to tell me how he had not only been forced to defend his life and property, but had taken the lives of 3 men who tried to kill him. I asked if he was a veteran because he looked about the age to have served in Vietnam, but he shook his head. He never served a day in his life. It had been a home invasion, and according to him, it was the most important thing that ever happened to him. The old man said that he lived in a big farmhouse that he'd inherited from his folks many years before. After his wife passed away and his 3 sons grew up and moved to the city, he was left all alone. That quiet lifestyle suited him for a while. But then, the opioid crisis got a real hold on his county. Everything changed. Theft and violent crime shot through the roof. And once the pharmacies and corner stores had been hit, the addicts started targeting people in their homes. The first time the old man was robbed, they took tools from his shed while he was in town. They must have figured out it was just him living there alone, because they started hitting his property at least once, sometimes twice a week. He took to staying up on his porch with a thermos of coffee and a hunting rifle, just waiting for them to show up, depriving himself of sleep like that dam near made him sick. But one night, he saw the beams of flashlights at the end of his long, wooded driveway. Minutes later, 2 addicts were sneaking up the path. Just as they came close enough, he fired a warning shot into the trees over their heads. But instead of taking off like frightened deer, the addicts started shooting back with a small pistol as they ran off. The old man ducked for cover as bullets zipped past him. The last thing he heard before they drove off was, "We'll be back, you old fool. And when we do, we are going to kill you." The old man went to talk to the town sheriff, who told him that while he had every right to use lethal force to defend himself. It might not be a good idea if he was outnumbered by a couple of desperate addicts. Under any other circumstances, the sheriff might have posted a deputy nearby. But with the recent crime wave, he just didn't have the men to spare. The sheriff told him that on this occasion, it might be best if he made himself scarce for a few days, after making sure his home insurance was paid up. He was entitled to stand his ground and fight, but he had to ask himself, was that old empty house worth dying for? The old man said he told the sheriff that he was right, and that he'd head out of town for a week, then come back and deal with whatever was left. He even made a show of packing a bag and driving away. But he didn't go far. He just parked his truck down the road and waited, after making a few arrangements of his own. A few days later, the old man called the sheriff and said he had come home to find a terrible smell coming from the old root cellar behind his house. The house was fine, but the cellar was another story. When the sheriff arrived, the smell was almost unbearable, but it didn't take long to figure out why. Inside the dark, stone cellar, he found 3 dead bodies. A short while later, the sheriff figured out that the 3 local addicts had been fighting and had ended up killing each other. At first glance, it looked like they had gone into the cellar to hide or use drugs, and in their stupor had accidentally locked themselves in. The sheriff said he'd never seen anything like it. He told the old man that the heavy wooden door must have swung shut, and the thick iron bar on the outside must have fallen into place, trapping them. According to the sheriff, it was a 1-in-a-million freak accident. The sheriff then asked him, real plain, if he had anything to do with that bar being in place, and the old man said no. So that was just about the end of it. Except that wasn't strictly true. Not only had he planned the whole thing, but he'd never even left his property. The old man told me he'd emptied out the old root cellar, which was almost impossible to break out of from the inside. He made sure the heavy door swung shut easily, and that the iron bar would drop securely into its bracket. He then got busy with the next stage of his plan, making the inside of that cellar look like it was where he stored his valuables. He used a few old chests he had in the attic, filled them with rocks to make them feel heavy, then left the heavy cellar door slightly ajar like it was bait. The next night, those addicts showed up just like they'd promised. 3 of them, all armed. They came to get revenge for the warning shot. But upon seeing that cellar door open, they must have thought he was hiding something valuable in there. They just couldn't resist. All 3 climbed down into the darkness, probably crowing like they'd hit the jackpot. Then out came the old man from his hiding place on the porch to slam the cellar's heavy door shut, dropping the iron bar and locking them inside. First, the addicts were startled by the door just slamming shut on them. Then they got frustrated when they realized there was no handle on the inside. It took them a while to understand that they were trapped. But once they did, they started to panic. The old man said they tried shooting at the door, but the old wood was too thick. He said they spent hours trying everything they could think of to get out, but it was no good. There was no way out. The cellar was inescapable without serious tools. It took those fools hours before they figured out they were trapped for good. And when they did, they started calling for help. And then, and only then, did the old man call out to them and tell them exactly what had happened. He said they were furious and tried firing shots through the door in his direction. But as his presence there before me that night confirmed, those shots went nowhere. He told those foolish men exactly how he tricked them into walking into their own tomb. He said it was only when he used that word, tomb, that it really dawned on them what was happening. He said they begged and pleaded, swearing they wouldn't hurt him if he'd only let them out. They went from promising not to hurt him to promising him thousands of dollars. The old man said he knew it was all nonsense. They would have said anything to get out of that cellar. And unfortunately for them, it was way beyond forgiveness. See, most people would have trapped those men, called the sheriff, and then laughed as they were dragged out in cuffs. But that's not what the old man had in mind. He let those men stew in that dark, damp cellar with no food or water for 3 whole days. By then, they were dehydrated and starving. After that, he didn't think it would be much longer before they turned on each other. And when they did, it sounded like a war in there. I'm not saying those boys didn't get what they deserved. There's something grimly appropriate about them getting caught in a man-sized trap. But what really sent a chill through me was how proud that old man was of himself, and how he laughed until he wheezed thinking about them begging for help. He said they were praying, crying for their mothers, and he was grinning like a demon, telling me the things he'd say to them. He used to talk about them eating each other, wondering who was going to be first. He did his best to make sure they went slowly insane from thirst and hunger until they finally just snapped. As I mentioned already, I'm not saying those addicts didn't get what was coming to them, but it was the way that old man described the whole thing, how he was proud as a peacock for what he did. That's what I found so chilling. If he wanted to deal with them permanently, he could have handled it in 100 other ways. But he let those boys starve and dehydrate and slowly lose their minds until the thought of turning on each other was all they had left. At first, that old man had seemed like a decent man, and I guess he was in some ways. But to think that he had that kind of cruelty in him, that kind of darkness, I'm not ashamed to say that it terrified me. I also know that if those addicts had gotten their hands on him, they would have done equally terrible things. but you expect that kind of behavior from those kinds of people. I didn't expect that man to have ever done something like that, and certainly not to find it all so amusing. I mean, he laughed himself into a coughing fit after he mimicked one of the men wailing, "Mama, Mama, I'm so sorry." And I shuddered just imagining it. Again, I'm not saying that that man didn't do what he had to do. I'm just saying I think he went about it in a completely wrong way and lost a piece of his soul in the process. I remember when I was a kid, I would go to concerts with my older brother, and it was something that we bonded over. When he moved across the country for a job when I was in high school, I stopped going to shows, though. It just did not appeal to me like it did when I would watch my favorite bands with him. A few years ago, I fell in love with live music all over again. Now, for some context, I was 28 years old when I started following music again. I would watch live streams with one of my best friends and her husband, and Friday nights became a tradition at her house. Good food, good friends, and good times. Falling in love with music again started to bring back so many fond memories that I had with my brother. I know a lot of people out there may not enjoy loud rock music, but sometimes the memories you can make can go far beyond the event itself. However, the memories are not always good, and this story that I am about to tell you happened last year. And instead of a fond memory, I was left with a very lasting nightmare. As I mentioned a moment ago, I got back into music a few years back, but I was not able to attend a big show until last year. My buddy surprised me on my birthday with tickets to a huge music festival, and I was beyond pumped. This was going to be the first festival I had attended since before high school. My town, unfortunately, is quite small, and the closest major venue is almost 3 hours away in North Carolina. I did not want to drive all the way home after the concert, so I decided to actually book a cabin rental close to the amphitheater. My friend, who got me the ticket, was also attending the show with me, and she was bringing her husband as well. They did not want to stay after the show, so they planned on driving home after, and this was honestly fine with me. I was actually looking forward to the quiet evening to myself. The show was awesome other than one minor hiccup towards the end of the night. The headlining band was playing their final song, and the crowd was a chaotic sea of people. As you might expect, the crowd was going insane. So insane that someone actually shoved into me and caused me to bump into the man in front of me, making him drop his phone. The screen shattered on the pavement, and he was not pleased. I apologized profusely and offered to pay for the repair, but he continued to lay out this very verbal assault. After a minute or two of getting yelled at, the man stormed off into the crowd, as did I. Not long after, the show ended, and we all started the long walk back to our cars. I won't say what the band was for my anonymity. That night, I got back to my cabin rental and just kind of hung out and relaxed. I decided to heat up a frozen pizza and just sort of enjoy my little scenic getaway. The place was very cozy and on the outskirts of that town, and it was not like in the middle of nowhere or anything like that, but it definitely felt kind of secluded. I am not exactly sure what time I fell asleep, but it was late, after midnight for sure. And at some point during the night, I woke up because I thought that I could hear this very strange noise. I sat in bed for a minute trying to focus, and I did not know if it was just my imagination or if I actually had heard something. A few seconds later, I heard it again. A distinct snapping sound from the woods just outside. This was not the house settling or any of the other things that people say when they think you are being paranoid. This was without a doubt the sound of someone walking through the trees, stepping on dry twigs. I got out of bed and turned most of the lights on, mainly because I was a little spooked, but also because I did not know the layout of the cabin, and I did not want to stumble my way through the darkness. I am a bit clumsy, and I have a knack for breaking things. I made my way to the window that overlooked the woods. That is where I had heard the sound coming from. I cupped my hands against the glass and looked into the darkness, but I did not see anything. I was convinced that whatever I had heard was probably just an animal. And being the anxious person that I am, I just decided to go investigate outside on the porch. I understand this may seem like the worst idea in the world, looking back, but I convinced myself that nothing was out there except maybe some wildlife, and I just wanted to make sure. I spent a few minutes outside on the wooden porch, just breathing in the cool night air, and I did not see anything weird or out of the ordinary. I did hear a rustling in the bushes where I thought I had heard the sound, but it was a pretty wooded area. I decided to chalk up this entire ordeal to just my anxiety and nerves and being away from home. I started making my way back to the door, and that is when I froze, because I had turned a lot of the lights on. I was able to see inside the house from outside, and there, walking through the small kitchen, was a person, a tall man wearing a dark jacket. I was able to see his silhouette through the window clear as can be, and I immediately stepped back into the shadows of the porch, ducking down. Thankfully, I had my cell phone with me, and immediately I called 911. While I waited for the cops to show up, I just sort of watched this figure through the windows, slowly creeping through the cabin. He seemed to be opening drawers and even checking the small closet by the door. I had my purse on a little table in the kitchen, and this person went through my bag. He even grabbed my wallet and went through it a bit, but did not even take anything. After a couple of minutes, this person started to move a little faster. He was whipping open doors, and he looked like he was looking for something, and he looked frustrated. He must have heard the police, because as soon as I heard the faint sound of a siren, he bolted out the back door and disappeared into the dark woods. I came out from behind a porch column and flagged down a cop car and tried telling him that the intruder had just run. But they were very focused on calming me down in that moment. Finally, the police were able to take my statement, but by that time, this intruder was long gone. To my knowledge, they never caught this person, and nobody knew what he was doing or who he was looking for. The owners of the cabin were alerted by the authorities, and they claimed that they had no idea why anyone would do that. And I believe them. I remember telling my friend the story that next morning, and she believed that it might have actually been that disgruntled man from the concert, the one whose phone I had caused to break. I think it would be outrageous and borderline improbable for an intruder to have followed me all the way home. But the more I thought about it, this person did fit the profile of that angry fan. He was even wearing a dark jacket, but that might have been common for a cool night as well. And this all could have easily been a coincidence, but I do not know. It really made me think. And it is really scary that sometimes people out there can just do things like this, and we truly will never know why. I used to live on Rutledge Avenue, near the historic district in Charleston. My local coffee shop was a little place on Broad Street. So every time I needed my morning caffeine fix before work, I would walk all the way down Rutledge from my apartment, which was in a converted mansion at the very top of the street near Hampton Park. Most of the houses on Rutledge are basically old antebellum mansions. I am talking beautiful old buildings with long drives and grand entranceways that I am guessing used to be occupied by the city's elite. But nowadays, most have been converted into apartments which have 5 to 7 flats in them. Some of them boast some truly exquisite architecture. But while they are nice to glance at, it is generally not good form to stop and stare at someone's house or place of work. So I just minded my own business and kept on walking past. But that is not to say that I did not notice that 1 or 2 of the old mansions had been converted into stuff that was not apartments. I knew one had been converted into a small private school, and another was like a fancy law firm or something. But I was never curious to find out anything more about them. So, one morning, I leave for work at 8 a.m. So, I am walking down Rutledge, still half asleep, earbuds in, podcast on, and some coffee in hand. And I was about halfway down the road, headed for the city center, when I saw a man standing still on the pavement in front of me. It looked like he was waiting for someone, maybe a ride to work or something, but other than very briefly regarding him, I did not pay much attention to him at all. And that all changed, though, when I walked past him. And he said something that I could not make out over the noise of my podcast. I was almost certain that it was directed at me. So I stopped and pulled out my earbuds, and then asked who he was talking to. He was looking right at me as I turned. So clearly he was talking to me, but he did not answer my question or anything. He just kept on talking, even though I had not heard the first thing he had said. I remember exactly what he said, because it was one of the weirdest things anyone has ever said to me in my entire life. He goes, "The river of innocence flows into the sea of fire, and the tide is always rising." It probably took my half-asleep brain a microsecond, longer than it normally would. But as soon as I realized the fellow was just chatting nonsense, I said, "Yep, okay," in like a sort of please, do not kill me, crazy person kind of way, and then carried on walking towards my job. I suppose if you live in any city on the planet, you are just bound to encounter a few head cases from time to time. I just did not expect to encounter one that early in the morning. It did not scare me or anything. I just thought, what a weird bloke. And then, by the time I got to the library and saw the massive stack of books that I had to work through, it was basically forgotten about for the next 8 hours until it came time to commute home again. The fellow was not there that time, nor was he there any other time I walked down Rutledge Avenue for the next 2 months. But then one morning, bright and early, there he was again in the exact same spot I had seen him the first time. And he was not alone. The fellow was standing with 2 women, both in their 50s or 60s, who both appeared to be praying, since there were 3 of them on the pavement. I decided to cross over onto the other side so I would have more room to pass. But as I did, I could not help but peek over at the 3 of them. The fella caught me looking, and although he did not say anything, we locked eyes, and he gave me a grim nod before I quickly turned my head away. But before I did, I noticed the 2 women who look like they were reading from little prayer books appear to be whispering something too, like they were praying aloud. Now, this is the point where a lot of your listeners are going to stop and think, hang on, this sounds familiar. And to be fair, if you are thinking what I think you are thinking, then you are thinking the right things. The issue in question is a massive deal over here on this side of the pond. I am not trying to turn it into a dunk on anyone. We just have different issues over here. Cue the overwhelming and unflattering agreement. And that is why I could walk past them a second time and not piece together what they were doing with where they were choosing to do it. I blame it on the sleepy brain, personally. Both times I saw the weird fella, I had only been awake 30 minutes, and since I was on my way to work, I did not exactly have time to stop and chat. It was literally days later when I realized that they were standing outside of the building I thought was a law office, facing the place from across the street. So, I decided to employ a bit of the old Google foo to try and work out what was going on. It was called something like the Palmetto Clinic. Not its actual name, of course, but something equally unassuming. It then took me mere minutes to figure out what its purpose was. There was a lot of flowery language around the subject. They just did not come out and say it on one page. But after just the teeniest bit of clicking around, I discovered what the clinic was for. It was not a law firm. It was an abortion clinic. And that is why the people were praying outside of it. I have since come to learn that protesting abortion clinics is quite a big thing in the States. And a lot of the time, the protests get pretty vicious, I guess. Now, before the comments section erupts, I would like to make it clear that I am not trying to cast dispersions on anyone. In a free country, people should be free to pray wherever they want, right? And I do not live there, so I do not really know exactly what is going on. But that is not what I found so creepy about that man. The one who said that initially unintelligible thing to me about the river of innocence. He was talking about the aborted babies, and he was talking about them being sent to hell. I think you would have to be exceptionally sturdy of a person for that mental image not to send a shudder through you. It certainly did with me once I realized what that guy was referring to. Sometime after that, I heard about the fella getting arrested. I am guessing someone reported him to the police, and that he was in the habit of saying things to people as they walked past. I do not know what law that is breaking, but that is just not on, is it? Saying things like that to people going through a horrible period in their lives. Now, I know this can be a controversial topic, but I do not know. If you are going to pray, do it quietly across the street, like those two women. Do not make a big thing out of it. And certainly, do not go telling passing strangers things about rivers of babies flowing into hell. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, lovely souls. I hope this story brought you a moment of calm and curiosity. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring these quiet moments together. Now, take one last deep, gentle breath. Get cozy and let the calm of the night carry you softly until we meet again.